I'm Kit Leggett, and I am part of the subcommittee of social studies at HASP. And I am pleased to welcome today, and I think you will be too, our presenter, Dr. Tato, and she said her last name is pronounced Gulia Miran. And maybe I put an extra accent in there. I hope I didn't. She is assistant professor of Spanish at Hope, and she has been there since 2015, and she holds a doctorate in Spanish from Purdue University. Her course today, and there are 2 sessions, by the way, so we'll get double the good instruction with Tato, and it's called Jews in Spain Before 1492. So today we'll probably talk about all the events prior to 1492. Outside the classroom, Tato has interests in their musical. She enjoys playing Chopin on her piano, and she sings. This is interesting to my husband and to me. She sings with the Hope College Community Choir, and that sounds fascinating. So I would like to turn it over to Tato and her fascinating topic today. Thank you for being with us, Tato.
Thank you, Kit, for the amazing introduction, and thank you, HASP, for inviting me to give this talk. I am so excited to be here, and this is a topic that I'm extremely passionate about. I know some of you here, and if you know me, you know that I'm all about diversity, and I really enjoy looking into diversity and just global societies in early modern period, particularly in Spain. So this is something that I absolutely love learning about and exploring, and I love sharing what I have learned with you today. So I am going to share my screen to be able to kind of guide you through several things that I have prepared for you. Today we will be talking about the Jews in Spain. There are going to be 2 sections, as Kit mentioned. There is going to be one about the Jews in Spain before 1492 and another one after 1492. And I will explain why this specific time period. I am going to, here we go. So today's session, we're going to focus on pre-1492, and we're going to discuss how the Jews lived in what many call peaceful diversity to persecution. So I thought it is very important to talk about early history of Spain to kind of get an understanding of what Spain looked like before 1492, and understand how the origins of the Jewish communities came into the Iberian Peninsula. We will also be looking at the life of the Jewish people, the Jewish communities, and we will be looking at the religious persecutions in the late medieval period, ending today's talk with 1492, which is a very important date for the history of Spain, especially for the Jewish people who used to live in Spain during this period. Let's go over early modern Iberian history. I will try to be quick. So here we go. This is the Iberian Peninsula. You will hear me referring to this peninsula as Iberian Peninsula or Spain. During different periods in history, Spain and Portugal kind of were a different thing, then they were the same thing, but you will generally be hearing me referring to the Iberian Peninsula as Spain, because Spain and Portugal at some periods were kind of one thing. So let's start from the beginning. Who came to Spain and what was Spain composed of? The history of Spain starts early on, and when civilization started traveling from northeastern Africa, they came and settled into the Caucasus region, and then European people that we know now, most of them or everyone almost, came from the Caucasus. And the Caucasus people, before coming to Europe, they were the Celts, they were the Iberian people, the Phoenician, the Tartessas. By the way, one quick note, I'm so used to speaking about this in Spanish, so sometimes I might accidentally say the word in Spanish. Please keep that in mind and make a note so I can explain later. I do this subconsciously. So The Celts and Iberians and Tartessas, all of them came from what is the Caucasus region now. The Caucasus region is now Georgia, Armenia, Turkey, those countries. And back at that time, they were the Celtic civilization and the Iberians. The Iberian Peninsula, the whole peninsula where Spain and Portugal are now, comes from the Iberian civilization. You can see the distribution of different people living at different parts of Spain, and you can see different languages spoken in Spain. Starting later on, Phoenicians, who are people that would be from now Syria, Lebanon, around that area. Phoenician people were the next that came to Spain, and the knowledge that they brought with them was a knowledge of navigation. They brought in the alphabet and knowledge of trade. So starting that period, Spain kind of became a more savvy, a more kind of knowledgeable country and started having trade relationships with the countries and civilizations around. A seminal point in the Spanish history is when the Roman Empire extended until Spain. So they conquered the Spanish peninsula and established the Roman Empire there. They called the peninsula Hispania. Until now, we call Spain Hispania. In many languages, it is called Hispania. In Spain, Spain is called España. So this is coming from the Roman times. When Romans came to Spain, they did a bunch of important changes. They changed a lot of the life of the Spanish people. First of all, they brought in law. So they established the Roman law in Spain, which was kind of part of the Spanish history until many centuries later. These are all pictures that I took last time I went to Spain. This is the famous aqueduct of Segovia. This was built in the 1st century AD by the Romans. So they kind of established the water irrigation system, and that was a huge advancement for Spain. And you can see this little road. This is in the city of Toledo, actually. There is one church on the left of this, on the right side of this picture. And anyway, so this is the old part of Toledo. And you can see a highway that the Romans built. It is still preserved. So there's such rich history of these sites that Roman people built in Spain. If any of you have been to Merida, you've probably seen the jewels of Roman people that are still preserved in that beautiful city. After the Romans came, established the Roman Empire, an important point of history for Spain was the Visigothic rule. The Visigoths, again, came from eastern part of Europe, a little central east or northeast of Europe. And after the siege of Rome, they moved toward the peninsula, and they reached there around 400, 500 AD. This was a very important period for the Spanish history because the Visigoths were Christians, and they kind of set the premise of the Christianization of Spain and the importance of that religious kind of establishment of Spain. As soon as they came to the Iberian Peninsula, they unified many parts of Spain, and one of the most prominent kings is King Rodrigo. Here you can see what he looked like. After the Visigoths, the Spanish peninsula was ruled by Arabs. As many of you know, the Arabs came to Spain from the northern part of Africa, namely what is now Morocco, Algiers, and so on. And they started conquering the peninsula from the south up to the north. And all these Visigothic, Hispano-Roman people, all these Christians went up north and north and north and north until it came to be this little orange strip that you can see. So they were kind of pushed up north, and the Arabic rule was established in Spain called Al-Andalus. Andalusia in Spain now still bears the name of Al-Andalus Empire, or the Arab rule. This came to happen until the 11th century, and the Visigoths, or the Christian, now Spanish people that were now in the north, around here, as you can see, They said, no, we want to be a Christian state. We want our land back. We don't want to have an Arab ruler in our peninsula. So what we're going to do is we're going to reconquest all that was ours. And this movement was called the Reconquest. The Reconquest started in the 11th century and ended in 1492, which is the kind of the end of our talk today. We'll refer to that in a minute. And so what is important around this period is that the epic poem of Spain was written during this period of time, recounting the story and history of the Reconquest, particularly the one about Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, who is the Cid, and the epic poem of Spain is called the Song of My Cid. The earliest version of this is believed to be found in the 13th century. And another important point of history of Spain is, of course, the Catholic kings. These are the kings that are probably the most talked about kings in Spain, because during their rule, a lot changed in Spain. And this is the reason why the course is divided between before 1492 and after 1492, because many people say that you can trace the history of Spain, the modern history of Spain, to 1492, which was the end of the rule of the Moorish king in Granada. This was the complete unification of the Catholic kingdoms in Spain, and what became to be called the Catholic Kingdom of Spain. This is the beginning of the Spanish Empire, and that is why we are going to divide it into these two parts. So who are the Catholic kings of Spain? There is the Queen Isabel and the King Fernando. They were the Queen of Castile and the King of Aragon. They were two Christian kind of kingdoms, and their marriage in 1469 was a very hasty, arranged, and kind of a very controversial topic. It's a very interesting historical recount of the events because they were very young. First of all, Queen Isabel was 18 years old and Fernando was hardly 17. And they were related, but their marriage is also symbolic because it was not just a marriage between two kingdoms. It was also a marriage to unify Spain. And under their marriage, more Spanish kind of kingdoms became unified. Well, first of all, Castile and Aragon. And at the end of 1492, the last kingdom, the last Arabic kind of ruler was kind of surrendered in Granada. So many of you mentioned that you have been to Granada and you have seen Alhambra. This is exactly where the king of Granada, Boabdil, who was a Muslim king, gave the keys. They surrendered. There was no battle. They knew that there is no way that they're going to be able to defend themselves and maintain their kingdom. So there is even a painting. I should have included that painting, but if you Google it, there is a painting where it shows how King Boabdil hands the keys to Alhambra, and thus the Moorish kingdom of Granada falls. This is also the year where Catholicism is established in Spain, and Spain becomes a Catholic kind of state. There are many rules. We will talk about those rules of what needs to be done to kind of maintain this unified Catholic identity of Spain, which also has a very destructive effect, not only in Spain, but also in places around. I will briefly mention that in a second. And 1492 is also the year where the Jewish people were expelled from Spain. 1492 is a very important year as well because this is when the first grammar book in Spanish was published. Antonio Nebrija published this book, and this is the grammar that we're still using in the Spanish language. So that was kind of the roots and the establishment of the Spanish grammar. And 1492 is also the year when Christopher Columbus discovered America. So this is a very important year in the Spanish history, and we will end our talk with this year today. So I've kind of given you an idea of what Spain looked like around this time. As you see, there was no mention of the Jewish people because Jewish people never ruled Spain, but they were an integral part of the Spanish community and the Spanish society. Now let's remember these periods, right? Please remember the Visigothic rule, remember the Arab rule, and remember the Catholic rule, because we will be looking at how the lives of the Jewish people were during these three kind of general periods of the Spanish history. Now let's look at how the Jews came to Spain. So there are early mentions of the Jewish people coming to Spain from biblical times, but more historically recorded appearance of the Jewish people in Spain and the Iberian Peninsula is when the Phoenicians came to Spain. Later, the Jewish people came to Spain with the Romans. So in the first, in centuries before the first century. But in Rome, there was the expulsion of the Jews in 139. You will see a small plaque here that represents that expulsion of Jews. So even before Christ, even in the years before Christ, Spanish people had Jewish communities very prominently present in different societies. The destruction of Jerusalem was one of the main points where a lot of Jewish people traveled to Spain and established there. So this is a painting that represents the siege of Jerusalem by David Roberts. And so more and more Jewish communities came to Spain and started forming communities and becoming a prominent part of the Spanish history. This is what many Jewish people are referred to, Sepharad. Sepharad in Hebrew signifies Spain. And when we talk about Sephardic Jews, these are the Jewish people who lived in Portugal and in Spain in the medieval period. The Sephardic Jewish culture is very unique to the Spanish culture because, again, they lived through Christian rule and then Arab rule and then reconquest and then more Christian rule, right? And the Sephardic culture in that sense is very unique because there is a lot of assimilation, cultural and religious and so on. And they also have established kind of their culture. So if you search on YouTube to hear Jewish music, you gotta search Sephardic Jewish music to be able to look into this specific kind of period and area of the Jewish communities. So what is notable about the Jewish people is that when they came to Spain, during the Visigothic rule, it was a very different, during the Roman times, there was kind of assimilation of everything. Visigothic rule was a little difficult for the Jewish people because Visigoths were Christians. And so a lot of Christians in the ancient times, in old times, believed that the Jewish people were responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And so they didn't like them. And for that reason, it was very difficult for Jewish people to kind of cohabitate with Christians. It was relatively peaceful. It wasn't great. It wasn't awful. When the Muslims came to Spain during the Arab rule, I'd say that was the most peaceful time of the Jewish people cohabitating with other religions. But the worst time for Jewish people in Spain was when the Reconquest started, because at this time there was a huge religious kind of ideology that everyone needed to be Christian, that this was the identity of Spain. And so the Jewish people again were marginalized and were discriminated against, again, because of the belief that they were the reason that Jesus Christ was crucified. So let's look into some of the practices that the Jewish people had. Again, the best time for the Jewish people to have lived in Spain was during the Muslim rule, although it wasn't perfect. But this is Santa Maria la Blanca in Toledo. If you have been to Toledo, this is the old synagogue that was built in Toledo. Right now, it's a church. So it is serving as a Christian religious practice in place. But what was interesting about the Sephardic Jews at that time is that when they were building any religious practice places, they had to be oriented to face Jerusalem. And an interesting practice was that the high-ranking Jewish people would come into the salon, kind of the central space, and will be allowed to sit. The people, usually the men, who are not of high-ranking positions in the society, would come and stand behind these arcs. So you can see around here, right? They won't be allowed in the central part. They would be kind of like in the margins, and women were not allowed inside. There were specific places for women that could come and watch whatever was going on and practice their religion and worship. So next to these synagogues, there were these madrasas in Spanish, or in Hebrew, Beth Midrash. These are the houses of learning. This is a direct translation of that. And these are small schools. In these schools, people would learn about religion, first of all. So they would study religious texts. A lot of the education was oral. So the written tradition is not as widespread at this moment because many people could not write, and only high-ranking people in the society were able to receive education to read and write. Most of the people received the education of in an oral form, so storytelling, right? And in these places is where the art and music started coming out, right? They got educated, they started writing music, they produced art, and these were all practiced in communal spaces. So outside of the school, they would have little plazas. Plazas are little squares where they would go and perform. And these musical instruments also are very interesting because they would be a mixture of a lot of traditions. So in the medieval times, for example, you would have Jewish people playing a Caucasian instrument, for example, something called kanon or something called saz. In this picture, you see saz, which is a Middle Eastern instrument played in many countries from the Caucasus to current Middle East. And the Jewish people kind of, their music was an amalgam of all of these cultural practices. Actually, I have prepared one video for all of us to watch to kind of get a sense of what music sounded like in this era. So if you would allow me, I'll play a little clip of Jewish music. Kit, will you please give me a thumbs up if you can see and hear my video? Perfect. So I hope this kind of gave you a sense of what it sounded like. And I will toggle my screen to back to my slide. So it's beautiful. Their production of art and music is beautiful during this time. And again, it was so diverse and it was an acculturation of so many different cultures that it's unspeakable richness of this culture. Jewish people lived in very specific houses. So their houses were very defined. You can see the explanation very well here. Usually they were multi-level and they had several entrances because, and it also depends if you were a rich Jewish person or a poor Jewish person, there would be some variations. But a very interesting fact that many Christians and Muslim people didn't do in Spain was having cemeteries in their yards. A lot of Jewish people had small spaces in their backyards where they would bury their family members. So this was an interesting fact that many Jewish people practiced, while a lot of Christians and a lot of Muslim people did not practice this. Some of you said that you have seen the Jewish Quarter. One of you said that you've been to Seville and have seen the Jewish Quarter. Every city had a Jewish Quarter. They're called Jewries. This is not offensive, but it does sound offensive, so I don't like saying this word. I'd rather say the Jewish Quarter of the city. In Spanish, it's juderias. And these were specific parts of the cities that were specifically for the Jewish communities. Here in this little map, you see the map of Sagunta. Sagunta is a city in Valencia, and you can see the central part of the city was the Juderia, and then there is a cemetery for the Jewish people on the outskirts of this, in the outskirts of this little part. The Jewries were usually where the Jewish people lived again. And when we talk about Spain, we usually talk about the diversity of Spain, right? But it was kind of gentrified, like we have in the United States. There's this problem, right? The people usually did not mix. So there was the Jewish neighborhood, there was the Muslim neighborhood, there was this Christian neighborhood. They didn't live together. There was very little mixed kind of communities. There are very few mixed communities, which was very interesting. What is also interesting is the occupation of the Jewish people during this time. There is this wonderful book that I had the honor to read and review about several months ago, about a couple of months ago. It's called Women and Communities in Early Modern Iberia. This is a beautiful recountal of the stories of women who lived in Iberian Peninsula. The writers are looking into the lives of women from different religions, Muslim women, Jewish women, and Christian women. And this is all based on archival research. So you get bits and pieces of information of what life looked like. So let me get one of the articles for you. It's called Credit and Connections, Jewish Women Between Communities in Vic by Sarah Ift Decker. An amazing story, a recountal of a woman's life whose name was Reina and how she connected the communities of Jewish and Christian descent in the city of Vic. Let's walk through the streets of Vic so you get an idea of how life would have been in there. Right now, you're probably seeing my Google map. Kids, can you give me a thumbs up if you're on my Google map? Perfect. So this is the plaza, and imagine this. I want you to transfer to medieval period and try to imagine what it would have looked like for Reina, who was this Jewish woman. She was a creditor, so a money lender. An interesting fact about her is that she was divorced once and remarried. So this kind of gives you an idea of what the life of the Jewish people would have been like. Christian people usually didn't have such great opportunities to marry, divorce, and remarry because of the strict Catholic rules, but the Jewish people did, and she was a money lender, and she did the business herself, and without her husband's help, pretty much, and she was able to lend money to a lot of Christian women in Vic and other small villages around Vic. So this article that Sarah Ift Decker writes is a great reminder that Jewish women had a prominent presence in their communities and were able to make such important decisions as money lending and just creditor work that many Christian women would not have been able to. So this is just a little kind of fun tour of Vic. If you ever go to Vic, remember Reina and her wonderful story. So I want to talk about something that is not very illuminated. This is something that people don't usually talk about because they say, oh, the Spain of three cultures, Toledo of the three religions, constantly referring to Spain as this tolerant place where Christians and Muslims and Jewish people lived in perfect peace and everyone was tolerant of another one. There was no discrimination. There was no such thing. It was a very difficult kind of cohabitation, and some of the times, some of the reasons I'll give in my notes below, but most of the time it was just obligatory. They had to live together because of the many rules that happens to be in Spain, from Visigoths to Muslims to Christians and so on and so forth. But most of the time they weren't amicable. They actually kind of tried to be amicable as much as possible. In this painting, you see a Jewish person and a Muslim person playing chess. This is usually coming on the books that talk about the tricultural Spain, or the diverse Spain of medieval periods. And that's very deceiving, because when you read about it, again, you think that the Jewish people had a good life in Spain, like Reina did. Like, she was crediting money here and there, and she was connecting all these communities. But how were Jews usually looked at? It wasn't that easy. So even during the Muslim rule, which was the most peaceful time for the Jewish people, there were awful happenings. In 1066, there was a Granada massacre. What happened was that someone went into the royal family and killed an entire family of Jews in Granada. And this was between Muslims and Jews. And I'm going to give you just a couple of kind of ideas and examples of how Jews were persecuted each century. Alfonso VI was a Spanish king and a king of Castile, and he was favorable toward the Jewish people. Many people hated that because, again, they were saying that you cannot be favorable toward the Jewish people, because, again, Jewish people were the reason that we Christians have suffered. Because if it weren't for the Jewish people, then Christ wouldn't have been crucified. So they began to riot against this favorability, this favoritism of Alfonso VI. And in 1108, a lot of Toledans just went around and robbed Jewish families and killed several people, burned houses and businesses that the Jewish people had in Toledo. So there was a lot of persecution and a lot of hate and a lot of anti-Semitism, even during these times that we think that Spain was tolerant and diverse and so on and so forth. In Europe around that time, the Crusades started. And of course, Spanish people in Toledo were like, of course, this is our holy war. So what they did, they organized their own holy war. And why is it in quotation marks? Because they never left Spain in here. But in Toledo in 1212, Spanish people, again, went around and massacred the Jews because that was their holy war. Because of this reconquest and the ideology that the Christian Spanish people are the true inhabitants of this peninsula, and then there were a lot of like Christian-centered, Catholic-centered ideologies being tossed around, and people had to be Catholic to be of pure blood. This is another thing that was very prevalent in Spain, pure bloods. That means that you have strict Catholic descent, you were of pure blood. So what was an interesting happening in Spain is that there came a rise of these mendicant friars. Who were these people? They were just friars who would just go around and preach. They were not connected to any church. They would just go around and preach. And these preachings were actually sometimes damaging because they were hateful, and they resulted in the massacre of Navarre region, which was in 1328. There was actually a very interesting book that I was reading the other day. It was called The Holy Hate. And this was about this specific preaching that was preaching anti-Semitism rather than true religious living style. 1300s actually started being the worst kind of years preceding to absolute worst times for the Jewish people in Spain, because more and more anti-Semitism was being circulated around people and was becoming kind of the state rhetoric. Peter of Castile, he was a ruler in Castile whose brother Henry II were rivals. They were rivals, and they had many battles against each other. Well, not real battles, but they were just rivals. They didn't agree on many things, and one of the things that they absolutely disagreed on was the Jewish people. Peter was a tolerant ruler while Henry II was not. And in 1366, there was another massacre of the Jewish people in the hands by the followers of Henry II, because the Jewish people kind of congregated around Peter and were helping him in his troops and in his endeavors to liberate parts of Spain and to define what Spain and parts of Spain need to be. And let's go to more events. 1391 is a seminal year for the Jewish people in Spain living in this period. What happened is there was this friar, Ferran Martinez. You can see him here. Ferran Martinez was one of these friars that was preaching anti-Semitism more than focusing on the Catholicism and the true nature of the Catholic religion. And so what he did was, again, this anti-Semitism went on and on and on and on. And they decided that the only true way of being in Spain is to be a Catholic. So what they did is they forced conversions. Everyone who was not Catholic in Spain had to convert to Catholicism. A lot of people, of course, disagreed with this, and this resulted in Barcelona massacre in 1391. If people were not to be subjected to these forced conversions, they were either being killed or expelled. And a lot of people from Catalonia were expelled into North Africa. So starting in the 1300s, a lot of Jewish people started leaving Spain because the situation and the living conditions and even the security of the Jewish people became increasingly thin. So they didn't see any way of being able to cohabitate with the Christian Spaniards. This was kind of a precursor for Inquisition. I call it pre-Inquisition because the persecution and religious persecutions started in late 1300s. As I said, these persecutions started then, kind of everything amplified and amplified and amplified. And after the marriage of the Catholic kings, Fernando and Isabel, Catholicism became this core identity of the Spanish people. And in 1480, the letter of Inquisition was decreed, and the Inquisition kind of became a law, and it became kind of like the established practice in the church. Tomás Torquemada, he was a terrible figure in Spain, and he was the head of Inquisition. Here you can see a little passage from the document of Inquisition. I'm going to read some of the documents and cite some of the documents by Cohen's who wrote Early Modern Spain, a Documentary History. So let me read at the beginning of this Inquisition letter. It says, letter of commission to carry out inquiries into bad Christians. Be advised that we have taken note that in our kingdoms and domains there have been and are certain bad Christians, heretics and conversos, who, despite receiving the sacrament of baptism and being baptized and having the name of Christians, have turned and converted and continue to turn and convert the sect, superstition, and faithlessness of the Jews. Desiring and wishing to resolve this problem, we're going to decree the following. And the following was that the inquisitors had the right to decide anything. Everything was at their disposition. And anyone who did not agree with the inquisitors, then they would be either killed or expelled, whatever the inquisitors decided. So they could be sent into prisons. Anything material that they had could be confiscated. So it was kind of giving the inquisitors any power that they needed to get rid of the Jews and the conversos. Conversos, by the way, I don't think I mentioned this. Conversos was a reference to the people who were Jews before, but chose to convert to Christianity, to Catholicism, to preserve kind of their security in Spain. And of course, we came to year 1492. As I said, this was a very important year in the history of Spain, but the worst year for the life of the Jewish people in Spain. This is the year that the Alhambra decree was signed, and by this decree, the Jews were expulsed from Spain. So Ferdinand and Isabel, they were not happy with the forced conversions. They still thought that the Jewish people kept practicing their religion, and they thought that they were being, they were lying to the Spanish society of their pure kind of, well, they couldn't be pure blood because they were not of Catholic descent, but their pure intentions, right, to be Christians, their true intentions of becoming real Christians. So they expulsed the Jews from entire Spain. Here you can see the decree of expulsion. This is actually a copy of the last page. It's a very long decree, several pages, and it gives kind of a detailed recountal of what will happen or where do they have to go and things like that. And here you have Emilio Francese's depiction of this moment where King and Queen signed this decree. I will read a couple of passages from this decree. So they said, I will just read a couple of things. They say that in Toledo in the past year of 1480, we ordered the separations of those Jews in all the cities, towns, and places in our kingdom and domains, creating separate places for the Jews to live, hoping that with this separation, the problem would be solved. But the problem wasn't solved, and this Jew, and the funny thing is the language, right? And sometimes it's so reminiscent of what we're hearing now, like these bad Christians or these Jews. It's not the Jewish people, it's these Jews. It's not like people who are not practicing the Christianity in the way that we propose or that the Catholic Pope proposes. No, it's these bad Christians. So with this hateful language, of course, they created this separation and this marginalization of the Jewish people. And they said that the Jewish people cause great damage, harm, and disregard for our holy Catholic faith. And for that reason, they decree the following. So they advised that several prelates and grandees and knights, they told the kings that these Jewish people cannot live in Spain anymore. And so they say that the coming July of this present year, they should not dare to return or to be in any part of our kingdom. So they had to go, and they can carry whatever they can carry on their backs, and everything else would be confiscated by the kingdom. We also order and prohibit anyone in these kingdoms or any estate, condition, or dignity whatsoever from daring to receive, take in, or shelter, or defend any Jew or Jewess, either publicly or secretly, and the penalty would be a death penalty. So this was the decree of the expulsions of Jews, and from the year of 1492, there were officially no Jews living in Spain. Of course, these numbers are exaggerated, but some count to up to 100,000 Jews being expelled from Spain at this point, but also remembered how many were massacred, how many were converted, how many were being, were trying to hide, and we're trying to hide and not reveal their identity, right? So in the next class, what we will be focusing on is what was the life of these conversos after 1492. We now know that in 1492, the last Jew had to kind of exit Spain. And so the remaining people were the conversos. So what did that mean for them? How was anti-Semitism disproportionately exaggerated later? How did Inquisition act once they didn't have Jewish people to persecute, right, or to look for? And how did religious intolerance affect the Spanish society? This year, the 1400s, end of 1400s until the 17th century are going to be our focus in the next class. And then we will look into the lifting of the expulsions. We will also look into the Jewish life in Spain now, because Jewish people have been able to return, and there are Jewish people living in Spain right now, and it's a complete different story. Then we'll try to make connections. How can we make connections, and how can we as a society in the United States take lessons from these horrible historic accounts, and how we can become a better population, better humans here in the United States, and even if we go to Spain. Thank you so much, and I would be happy to take any questions that you have. I'll stop sharing my screen and would be happy to engage in question and answer with you.
Hato, you do have some questions in the chat. Would you like me to go ahead and facilitate those first?
If you don't mind, I can read it because I am a visual person, so I have to read to understand.
Do you see where they are?
I can see.
Awesome.
Were the Visigoths an offshoot of the Romans? Thank you. That's a great question. You know, Visigoths were different people. They were not direct offshoots of the Roman people, but they had some Roman kind of Roman blood in them. They were Gothics, Visigothics, the Celts. Some of them were. So they were kind of an amalgam of many civilizations that were part of the Spanish culture. I have another question from Butchie, is that right? So what was the interest rate for the money lenders? It's a very interesting question, and we don't have much information about it because sometimes we don't see most of the transactions, and it differed from state to state or from region to region and from city to city. It is also important to mention that if it was a Jewish community, then it was favored, there were more favors for the Jewish people. Vic, the city the small town that we kind of get to experience through Google Maps a little bit, was a specific, very difficult case because as we talked about the Barcelona massacres in the 1300s, and Treina lived around that period. Vic was very Catholic, and around the Catalonian region, there were a lot of Catholic people. So it was very difficult for Jewish people to have a business and then to be a money lender. So they had high interest, and I can search the specific passage where it talks about the interest rates, but they were not fixed. They would differ from place to place. I hope this kind of answers your question. Diana asks a question, was the letter of inquisition a decree by the church or by the crown? What was the relationship? Oh, this is a wonderful question. So church and state were one thing in Spain at that time. And the separation of church and state for the first time it happened in France, the French Revolution in the 1700s. And then Spain followed, well, wanted to follow. But back in those days, church and state were one thing. So it was decreed by the crown. It was issued by the crown. It was signed by the king and queen. I, the king, I, the queen, and that's how the kings would sign these letters. Anne is asking a question, where did most Jews go after the expulsion? Were other countries receptive to them? Oh, Anne, this is such a beautiful question, and it's crazy. When you think about the Jewish communities everywhere, they cannot be peaceful anywhere because everywhere in the world, wherever you look at, the history is Jewish expulsions, Jewish persecutions. The anti-Semitism has been such a historical presence in our world that it's shameful that we as humans have not overcome this. But to answer your question, most Jews would go to North Africa after the expulsions. Many of them went to what is now Germany, Austria, Hungary, around that area. What are those called? The Low Countries, Países Bajos, which would be like the Dutch area, the Netherlands, and our familiar areas. And the countries were not receptive of them all the time. So many people also went to Egypt, and if you've been following, Egypt even had expulsions of the Jewish people in the 1960s and 1900s, quite recently. Many people went to the New World after the discovery of the New World. The last expulsion of the Jewish people in the history of our world was in 2014 from Guatemala. So some countries might seem like, oh, they're receptive of the Jewish people, and then something happens in their history, and they're like, oh, it's because of the Jews, and they expel them. It's a very, very sad reality that the Jewish people have to face. I was talking to my husband yesterday about this, and we were talking about the Jewish presence in the United States. Actually, the United States is one of the very few countries in the world that has never expelled the Jewish people. The biggest community, the second biggest community of the Jewish people is in New York. So the United States has been one of the countries in the modern history of the world that has been receptive of the Jewish people. Paul is asking a question. Were the conversos allowed to stay in Spain after 1492? Is it true that Tomás de Torquemada was a converso? Wonderful question. There are speculations that Tomás de Torquemada was a converso, and he wanted to hide his converso identity, and that is why he became an inquisitor, because again, as I was telling you, the Spanish people were obsessed about this idea of pure blood. They were so obsessed about this pure blood. There's literature written about this, and Cervantes, one of my favorite writers, Karen knows this. Cervantes writes a lot about the level of ridiculousness that this obsession gets to. There is one famous literary work, if you don't mind, I'll get a little distracted and tell you this one. Entremés, this is a little theatrical play in one act. There's one where people come and say, all right, we're going to set a play where it's all magic, and only those who are of pure blood, that is to say of pure Christian Catholic heritage, only those of pure blood will be able to see what's going on. And of course, they were just liars. They were trying to get money. So they get the people from the village, and they start saying, oh, now you can see some sun, and now you can see all these biblical characters. You can see the big flood, and so on and so forth. And everyone was like, wow, yeah, this is so great. I can't believe my eyes. No one was seeing anything. Everyone was scared that they will be perceived as a non-pure blood, which would be a great shame and a great dishonor. What happens is that someone from outside of the context comes running in and sees everyone just wowing and being in awe of these things that's happening that he couldn't see. And he's like, what are you talking about? I can't see anything. And then there is an attack, and people kind of kill each other because of this. So this is showing the ridiculousness of this obsession, the paranoia of people with this pure blood idea. So yes, Tomás Torquemada is speculated to have been a converso and having become inquisitor, specifically because he wanted to be perceived as a pure blood person. And the conversos were allowed to stay in Spain after 1492. They were referred to as conversos. There are many notable Spanish Spanish representatives of literature, so writers, philosophers, many people that are converso. One of them is Góngora, who is of Jewish heritage. Góngora is one of the greatest poets of Spain of all time, and he's the best Baroque poet, if you ask me, and he was a converso. And for that reason, he was ridiculed by another pureblood poet of Spain, a rival of his time, again, one of the greatest thinkers of his time, Quevedo. And we will be looking specifically into the converso life in the next session. If you are not going to be able to make it to the next class, I strongly recommend that you read Christina Lee. Her book is called The Anxiety of the Sameness. So anxiety of sameness. And this is specifically looking into the converso lives, the people who were converted from Judaism to Christianity, and moriscos. Moriscos were people who were Muslim, of Muslim descent, and were converted to become a Christian. So she specifically looks into this and the levels of ridicule that people would, the points that people would get to identify who is a Jewish person and who is not, or of Jewish heritage. So thank you. Mary Lynn, I'm sorry, were the Jews allowed to own land in Spain? Not after 1492, but before that, yes. 1492 was kind of the end of the discrete Jewish existence in Spain. This decree was later. This decree was later lifted. We'll talk about that in the next class. Now, of course, they can. And it's a little different times now too. But yeah, 1492 was kind of the cutoff year. Ben is asking a question. Were there certain professions associated with the Jews that affected their image and encouraged discrimination? Yes, and that was because a lot of the Jewish people were from affluent families, had a lot to do with finances. Many of them were bankers. many of them. And the Spanish people hated that because Spanish people, also there was an interesting fact about the case of Reina. Reina, by the way, is a Spanish word for queen. And Reina, who was a Jewish woman and she was a creditor, did not have women competitors because women in Spain didn't have the liberties of the Jewish women. So it was very different. And of course, there was this jealousy and this envy that the Jewish people can have this financial affluence while the Spanish people didn't. The Jewish people were great philosophers of the time. Many of them were philosophers, scholars, and medics. Many pursued the career of medicine as well. Priscilla is asking a question. Do you see any hope for anti-Semitism to diminish or disappear? I hope that it disappears. I do not see it happening soon. And this is a simple biological reason. There is a wonderful book called Behave by Robert Sapolsky. Robert Sapolsky is a neuropsychologist, a neurobiologist, and he looks into aggression and how aggression is born into a human life. So he looks at evolution, he looks at kind of the moment of conception, he looks at the fetal stage, he looks at our upbringing and up to the very moment that we make a decision to be aggressive, right? So it's a comprehensive study of the human behavior, the best that we could have done until this point. And he says that it's a part of human life. If it's not anti-Semitism, it's something else. But what he gives hope to us is, what we have a hope for is that we're learning to be better. So let's take an example. In 1900s, a very normal kind of entertainment for a regular Parisian would be getting a cat and burning them in the oil. And now we look at that, we just imagine that and we cringe because we've learned to be better. And so there is hope that we humans can learn to be better, but we all have bias and we all have to learn what is okay and what is not. Unfortunately, very few people are aware of their bias, and let's hope that we will be able to spread the word and teach people to be aware of their biases. And once people become aware of their biases, maybe they'll become better. So hopefully that'll happen. But I'm so sad to say this, but not in our lifetime. I don't think I'll see that in our lifetime. And pure blood, not so different from the US in the years of obsession with one drop of non-Caucasian blood. And you're very right. Unfortunately, the next class is going to be a lot. We are going to talk a little bit about the obsession of the US people with certain kinds, right? Because we also we're a secular country here, but sometimes we can't stand anyone that's not Christian, right? And so it doesn't have good, it just doesn't look good. And I don't think a country that aspires to be diverse and tolerant should have anything against anyone practicing something different than we do. The Anxiety of Sameness. Thank you so much, Susan. Yes, that is the book that I was talking about. Hope Library holds a copy if you want to get it. It's an academic book, but it's just fascinating. You read, and Christina is a dear colleague. So I wish there were more Christina Lees in this world, because shedding the light into the lives of early modern people and learning from their mistakes is such a great honor to have at this age and time. The book that I was just talking about, Priscilla is asking, it's called Behave by Robert. Oh, Priscilla, that's just you. Let me chat, everyone. So Robert Sapolsky, Behave. I think I just went through all the questions. I'm sorry, I talk a lot. I hope that this was okay information. I know I tried to pack everything in an hour, but I would be happy to answer any other questions you have or engage in other conversation.
And we appreciate how much you've talked and how much amazing information you've given us. We actually allot 90 minutes for these sessions, and we can certainly wrap up early. But if anybody, there's been great dialogue and wonderful questions. Does anybody want to just speak up and unmute their mic and pose a question now?
Tato, it's Kit. I was wondering what you might say about my mother, the physician that was mentioned. Would he have been um, expelled from Spain with everyone else? Was he kept on because of his promise? What can you tell us about him?
That's a great question. No, every single person was expelled. So in the next class, we're going to talk about the expulsions that happened after. And then when there were Converso people and Morisco people, the Muslim Christians, they now could pick and choose because there were certain parts of Spain that were heavily populated by these people. And for economic reasons and agricultural reasons, that Moriscos more, not Conversos that much, but Morisco people were great farmers, and they had extensive knowledge on agriculture. So in Navarre region and in Valencia region, many people were kind of saved, and they said, don't let the kids stay, but don't, but let the parents go. Kind of like they had to negotiate this, not to have a complete economic collapse. Because imagine just expelling so many people. Especially bankers, especially medics, especially professors, and so many intellectuals. Of course, it is going to have a very negative effect on the Spanish lands. But the decree of expulsions of Jews said that every single person, disregarding of age and sex and profession, had to leave. And I don't know if I can find that very specific line, but that was kind of what it said. I tried to paraphrase it the best I could.
I have a question. What do you have to say about the Moorish influence, the Muslim influence in Spain? Because there's so much that we kind of skipped over, but with the idea of philosophy, mathematics, and medicine, with the Muslim influence from in Spain during that time.
Oh, Muslim influence in Spain was immense and extraordinary and so rich and beautiful. Because the course was specifically focused on Jews, I didn't want to spend too much time, but there could be a full class taught on the Muslim influences in Spain. If you go to Spain, and I know many of you have been to Spain, you've already seen how much influence of the Muslim culture there is, even in the architecture that is so visible, that presence, right? The Muslim people were of prominent presence in Spain. Many of the structures that we see in Spain, the Alhambra Castle, for example, was built by a Muslim. King Boabdil was the last king living there. And if you walk into it, it's just, you can see the richness and the beauty of the Muslim culture in the architectural form. There are many cities in Spain that were very heavily populated by Arabs, even after 1492. People whom Spanish people called Moors or of Moorish descent. Moors are people who came from Northern African region. Again, this was during the Arab conquest, and they have Muslim descent. So mostly Northern African Muslim people are referred to as Moors. Very prominent presence in Spain. Last kind of Moriscos that stayed in Spain and were prominent figures were until 1609 to 1615. That was the last expulsion decree that was issued in Spain. And after that, more than 300,000 people left Spain. And Spain became this monocultural, very homogeneous place, mono-religious. Also had many problems with anyone and everyone who was not Catholic, particularly England. They were great enemies. Great enemies of Muslim descent. The Ottoman Empire in the 15 and 1600s was one of the greatest foes of the Spanish people. After these expulsions, I myself consider, many historians would have a different opinion, but I consider that the fall and the decline of the huge Spanish Empire, it was one of the most powerful empires in the world in the 17th century. But I think the fall of the empire started with these expulsions. Because all you do is with this discrimination and hate and anti everything and anything that is not Catholic, then and Catholic Spanish, right? Like it could be anything else, but it's just like you had to be Spanish, you had to be Catholic. And that's a huge hit to the economy, to the education, and what do you need for a prosperous country? Economy and education. So yeah, Richard, I don't know if this answered your question, but I hope it kind of gave you, yeah.
You do have a couple new questions in the chat.
Yeah, I'll be happy to read those. Lori is asking a question. Will you discuss what happens in Spain after the expulsion with the loss of medics and intellectuals and moneylenders all at once? A disaster, really. A lot of people take their place because the crown kind of mandates everything, right? So it was easily redistributable. A lot of possessions were reappropriated, and it was trying to kind of continue the legacy of these people. But of course, it's not as knowledgeable as before. And we don't see an immediate decline. We don't just see an immediate drop. This is something that was built through a long period of time, has reached its zenith, but then at that point, suddenly with the disappearance of all these knowledgeable people, all these people that have been prominent part of the community, then you can't live it up to that kind of standard. So it slowly declines. And as we see, the 1500s were the most florescent years of Spanish culture and history, 1500s and early 1600s. But then after that, there's a fast decline, and Spain goes into a very difficult economical, political, everything is difficult. And like I call it the dark ages until the late, probably like mid 19th century. It's a terrible, terrible time for Spain. So huge decline, a huge crisis in all senses of the word. Anne is asking, how long were Jews given to leave? Not long. It's actually written in the decree. They were given several months. So the decree was written in March, and they were given until the end of July. So several months. And they had to leave and find a place to leave and never to return. Most of the people, what they did, this is a funny thing that is a very big practice in Turkey, nowadays Turkey, but it used to be a practice in Spain. When people would leave, they always leave with the hopes to find something, to find their possessions when they come back. So they would bury their possessions, and then people would come and try to find those places and ransack and appropriate them. This is a huge problem in Turkey right now, because what they're doing is, because they ethnically cleansed their lands of Armenians and Greek people, now they're trying to do the same thing with Assyrians and Kurds. But what they did in the beginning of the 19th century, they kind of ethnically cleansed the Armenians and Greeks, and many people leaving, they buried their possessions in near their home sites, hoping that they could return and retrieve these possessions. But obviously no one did. And this is a huge business that people go and find ancient coins and gold and whatever, and they don't even give it to the museums. They either sell it or melt the gold and sell it. It's awfully sad, and it's just destroying the world heritage, especially the evidence of the indigenous people of those lands. So it's a sad, sad reality, which happened in Spain so many centuries ago and is happening today in other countries. So we obviously are not learning anything from the history, and we're continuing to be horrible people. So yeah, I have a question from Andrea and Eugene. Did Portugal experience similar expulsion laws? Yes, when I talk about these expulsions, many of them are from Spain and Portugal. So Portugal did experience this as well. Lori is asking a question. Do you see any similarity with what is happening now with the Catalonians? To be very honest, no. Catalonia has a very interesting and rich history because it's always been different. They've always spoken Catalan, well, not during the Franco period where they were prohibited to speak and learn Catalan. They had to speak only Castilian Spanish, or what we call Spanish. But Catalonian people are more interested in becoming a separate state. Same with people from the Basque country, because again, they have a pretty different identity and history. They are Spanish, but I don't know what to compare it to that would be that would be comparable to the American people. But imagine Californians, they call themselves the Republic of California, right? They're Americans, but they consider themselves different. Although Californian people have a similar kind of heritage as other Americans, because all of us are immigrants coming from different countries, or our ancestors came from different countries. So that unites the people of the United States. In Spain, that was the case, but Catalonian people have been able to preserve their identity pretty well. Same with Basque people, same with Galician people who were part of Portugal, and now they're kind of Portuguese, Spanish, kind of a mix there. So no, it's different because it's not religious. It's more nationalistic, and I hate using that word, but if I had to compare it to something else, it would be more like national identity than religious identity. And I have Sue, was there a Christian Catholic divide? Not that I know of. I know that there were Christian divides. There was a lot of a big divide when there was the Reform and the Counter-Reform in Spain and in other countries. There was a big divide between Catholics and Protestants, but nothing prominent that I'm aware of. Most people wanted to prove that they were Catholic and that they were born in Spain to Catholic ancestors and parents. So not that I know anything of Catholic divide.
I have a question for you.
Yes, Robert. Richard, sorry.
Did the New World riches help Spain, or how did it continue? If you said it started to fade out in the 1500s, wasn't this the time that they were bringing all the gold and silver back from the New World?
That is when the Spanish crown flourished. That is when they brought the riches, like you said, from the New World. 1600s is when it started declining because of the wars that it was waging left and right. It had a war with England, had a war with the Netherlands, the 100-Year War, the France, and many European countries. And then the end of 1600s, 1700s, the colonies of Spain started rising and revolting. And so that became worse and worse. So 1700s, beginning of 1800s was the worst time in Spain. 1898 was the last colony of Spain lost to the United States. It was Puerto Rico and Cuba. It's called the disaster of Spain. That's how disastrous it is. And it sounds as disastrous as it was kind of the end of the Spanish Empire. So it was a very long process. And like you said, Richard, from 1492 to the end of the 17th century, Spain was kind of on the end of the 16th century, I'm sorry, Spain was kind of rising. And then the fall wasn't also a downfall. It was kind of a slow decline.
I have another question. Did any of the conversos help with the New World conquest, the conquistadors? Did they in any way participate?
Many did. So this is a new research area that many people are trying to see. There were all kinds of conquistadors. There were Spanish conquistadors. There were all from all over the countries of that time's Europe. There were Black conquistadors that were Africans were helping the conquistadors, and they were transporting slaves into the New World and helping the Spanish, especially the Portuguese people, to carry some humans into the New World. Yes, there were all kinds of conquistadors. This is not something that is very well studied, but there were all kinds, and you would be surprised how many people and how unbelievable these stories might seem. But yes, if there was a converso inquisitor, then imagine.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Priscilla says, I just read The Long Petal of the Sea by Isabel Allende. It was excellent. Priscilla, that's one of my favorite books, and Isabel Allende is a prolific writer. For those who don't know, The Long Petal of the Sea is about a Spanish family who were based in Catalonia, and during the Spanish Civil War, which happened in 1936 to 1939, they kind of flee Spain because of all the atrocities that happened. Especially the Catalonian people suffered a lot during the Civil War and the dictatorship that followed. So they traveled to France, to the refugee camp, and then from France they traveled to Chile. And it's a family saga, I'd say. It's a family story, so beautiful and so rich in history and human emotions. If you haven't read it, please do. It kind of fulfills you in a way that this is how human lives are lived. So thank you so much for bringing this book up, Priscilla. You're right, it's excellent. Andrea and Eugene are asking a question. Did Sephardic Jews have a different language? It was a mix. That's a great question. So they would speak Hebrew, but most of them would speak Spanish because most everyone would speak Spanish. But there are many borrowings from Hebrew as well as Arabic in the Spanish language and Greek. Anyone who came to Spain and established themselves in Spain had a deep impact in the linguistic aspect of the Spanish language. So yes, they spoke Spanish, but they also knew Hebrew. And in the schools that they had, they would learn to read Hebrew too, to learn the holy texts. Effects of the fascist rule. Suzanne, I think, yeah, you're commenting on The Long Petal of the Sea. Yes, as you all know it, after the Spanish Civil War, which was between the Republicans who were fighting for freedom, democracy, communism, very liberal ideologies, actually. And then it was also the nationalist part, which was very Catholic, very nationalistic, fascist in a way. This was the side that won. And unfortunately, after the Civil War in 1939, there started to be a dictatorship in Spain until 1975, very recent, where the dictator Franco had a military and fascist rule in Spain. Very deeply sad times in Spain, really. There was a lot of censorship, a lot of hardships for the Spanish people, especially women, different religions, different identities of national identities, and so on, like the Catalonian people and so on.
Well, we've had some fascinating discussion. I'm not sure if you were prepared to go as long. I think you thought that it was just an hour. So we want to excuse you if you need to go. If anybody has another question, I would say bring it now. But we just.
I was going to mention that in session 2, and this sounds wonderful, 1492 to today, Tato was going to speak about expulsion and the effects of othering, and we put othering in quotes, and be here next week because that's going to be a really nice addition. What a great presentation. What a good discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm always delighted to talk about such important issues because, as you can see, this is still very prevalent right now. And you can apply it to different aspects of life and different parts of identities. So thank you so much for hearing me out. I know I talked a lot. I hope I didn't bore you. So hopefully this was informative, and I'd welcome any last questions you have before we go. Is that fine, Susan?
Yes, I don't want to rush anyone, but I also want to wrap up if it's the appropriate time. So thank you so much. HASP appreciates you, and you're just a fabulous presenter and professor, clearly, with deep, deep knowledge and able to field all those questions. And I did not overpromise when I said that our HASP members are very smart and inquisitive.
I love that.
I know, very, very much so. I do too. So thank you to everybody who joined the class today and who's still with us. Thank you, Professor. We appreciate it so much. And thank you, Kit, for your coordination of this class. So with that, I will go ahead and end and bid you all farewell.
Thank you all. Bye, everyone. Thanks so much.
We'll see you in the next class. Thanks.